Everything must change. Not
Hello, viewing audience, and welcome to the newest episode of Making a Difference in the Community, Unsung, Heroes, and Heroines. Today's guest is Mr. John Brewer, who's a local historian and author. He's also the owner of the Homewood Coliseum. Welcome to the show, John.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. I'm looking at your resume here, and it's quite interesting. We have that you graduated from North Carolina Central University and did some graduate work at Pitt, was employed by Equitable Gas for 30 years, and presently is the president of, is that Antar Corporation?
Yes.
Which owns the Pittsburgh Coliseum. He is a curator and founder of Charlie Station Oral History Center. He's a historian for the Pittsburgh Courier. He's a consultant to Carnegie Museum of Art and the Teenie Harris Project. And of course, many of us know that he and his wife were the owners of Ramsey's 2 Jazz and Food Venue. He is also on the John Hines History Center Advisory Board and the Pennsylvania Historical Commission Advisory Board. As an author, Mr. Brewer has authored 4 books. One is The African Americans in Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh Jazz is the second book. His third book is titled The Room, and his last book is entitled Kingpins of Pittsburgh 2016. So Mr. Brewer, it's obvious that you're very, very fascinated by history. Can you remember the moment that you decided to major in history?
Well, I believe when I was in grade school, I was at Crescent Grade School, and the school was primarily non-African American. It was primarily white, and I remember that they tried to actually the Harriet Tubman form of women, unbeknownst to me, went to the Board of Education and influenced them to put in an experimental class called Negro History. And so they did that. They tried it out at Crescent School, and I happened to be in that class. And I was in 5th grade. And so in that class, you heard discussions about people like George Washington Carver, Booker T. Washington, and some other people. But what it represented to me was that it was the first time that I saw real images of African American men and women who were excelling. Prior to that, all the images were basically kind of George Washington, cherry tree, white Dick and Jane type images. So at that time, and I was in the 5th grade, that weighed very heavily on me about getting into history because that history was unknown to me and to many others, and that played a very important part in my later selection to become a historian.
That's interesting. So, what that says to me is just how important it is to expose children to these type of things and how impactful, that whole exposure thing, can be. So you grew up in Homewood.
Yes.
And your father was my elementary school principal and a real hero in my life. Talk to us a little bit about growing up in Homewood as a child.
Well, I was born in East Liberty. We only stayed there for 1 year. And for years, my father always wanted this home in Homewood. So we moved to Oakwood Street when I was 1 year old. And so we lived on Oakwood, which is in Homewood. And so it was pretty fascinating because the people around me were all big-time achievers. My next-door neighbor, Mr. Robert Ratcliffe, he was the editor of the Courier. A couple doors down, Dorothy Damage's aunt, Helen Damage, she lived there. Attorney Barton lived one door down from her, and then one door over was Attorney Jones, who was later become the law partner for Homer S. Brown. Down the street was Judge Watson. He was an attorney at the time. So living there in Homewood and seeing these well, should I say, well accomplished men was a great visual. You know, walking up and down the steps and seeing these guys, you know, going to work, coming back from work, supporting their families. But more importantly, it was my father. My father being there in Homewood and taking a stand that it's a place he wanted when he was a young boy. And later, as he became successful and became the principal at Miller School, I recall seeing an article in the Courier stating a Negro makes $20,000. I said, man, my God, he made $20,000. We moved to Fox Chapel.
Which was big money at that time.
It was big money back then. I said, we moving out, Dad. We're going to Fox Chapel. And he said, no, boy, we're not going to Fox Chapel. I wanted this house as a very young boy. This is where I take my stand. This is where you make your stand. And so that was a platform for me to begin to understand that you need to take your stand. And what better place to take a stand than with your own people? So we lived there and we stayed there. And throughout my entire, grade school, high school, and even college, and even military life, that's where we lived, 578 Oakwood Street.
And in those days, Homewood was a powerhouse.
Yes.
Now your father was an All-American athlete, and you followed in his footsteps and became a great athlete. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, sports, I think for us, it was kind of a natural. My father had a twin brother named James, and they both were All-American from Virginia State. And so from the time that I was probably knee-high to this table, everywhere I went, everyone assumed I was going to play football. If I went to the barbershop, hey, man, when are you going to play football? if I went to the grocery store, hey, when are you going to play football? If it was time to get a Christmas present, I would get a football. So people assumed that. And so I began to I felt the power of having that kind of recognition. And so I went into sports I really enjoyed playing. I played a lot of sanctioned sports in the fields of Homewood and Huntersfield and Wilkesburg. Anywhere there was a field and we got X amount of young men, we would play ball. When I went to Westinghouse High School, that of course was a powerhouse. They were totally undefeated. Everyone had great respect for Westinghouse. It gave us individual players an extra stroke. A lot of people really needed to have that. And so I began to play with them. But then I found that, sports are a good thing, but the people who run the sports, the coaches and assistant coaches, they have a control over your life. And so at a later point, I really found that many of the players, many of us were being manipulated by the coach. That's why I wrote the book, The Room. It exposes that somehow playing sports is a great thing. However, it's not the only thing. And if you are developing a child, from childhood into early manhood, and hopefully that individual might want to go to college or trade school, whatever, after high school, it really comes into developmental skills. And we weren't getting that at Westinghouse at all. We were, in fact, if we got hurt, we were chastised. If we said, oh, I got a hurt arm, you can't do that. You have to play. And so there were many people who were hurt for a long period of time. I ended up with 4 concussions in my junior year after making All-City and All-State, and I ended up in the hospital. And that prompted me to make a decision with my father to go to Peabody High School. That's where I went in my senior year. And we came back and beat Westinghouse. And I really found when people began to respond to me, they weren't really responding to me. They were responding to the idea that you play for Westinghouse, it reassures us of a championship every year. You traded, you went to another school, we didn't go to championship, and we're really upset. Do you like me, or do you like my ability to play sports? And I found in some cases, friendships were false. Mm-hmm. You know, they were based on your ability to make a touchdown or a tackle, or whatever. Right. That was a learning tree for me, and that I've always cherished that learning tree because it helped me to make some decisions later on in my life.
And then you went on to historically black college.
Yes.
And tell us about that experience, how you made the decision. How you made the decision.
It was a no-brainer. I had 20-some potential letters of intent to go to colleges, some of the big schools, UCLA, Syracuse, and went to Penn State. And went up to Penn State, and they walked me through the cafeteria. It was like 5 black people sitting in the corner, and 4 of them were maintenance people. And so I didn't feel that was really what I wanted to be. Then I took the tour to go south. I went to North Carolina Central. They were called NCC at that time. And the ratio of females to males is 14-1 at NCC. Need I say more? You know, the campus was beautiful. The people were very friendly. And I felt as though that this was like being at home. Right. And so it was a no-brainer. I decided to go to North Carolina College.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. You know, spent a couple years at a historically black college as an athlete. And those people, some of those older professors and people, and they just were so dignified and graceful as they walked through the halls. And I would just look at them and just, you know, they were just so dignified, and so I'm very happy that I had that 2-year experience. Even though I transferred to the University of Pittsburgh, where I completed my education, but those 2 years, I cherished them.
Yes,
I cherished them. So then you played football, and you majored in history there, and you came. What did you do after college?
Well, actually, in between there, I did a little, you know, goof-off time, and I ended up getting drafted in the Army. So I was in the Army for 2 years. Okay. And that was really a great experience. I mean, I was I identified with the people who do, you know, some engineering, some chart operating, some special weapons things. And it was highly disciplined. It required one to recall information without having a book. In other words, all the information was classified, so you couldn't take it with you. Right. You had to put it in your brain. And that actually helped me. Later, when I came out and I decided to go back to NCC, that really helped me in terms of history. I could read and retain exactly you know, what I read. And it was a great disciplinary curriculum for me to follow, which seems to be a little bit unorthodox, but of course it worked.
Well, the theme of this show is making a difference in the community. Unsung heroes and heroines. And I connected with Mr. Brewer here through, if you saw my last show, through the American Heroes Project where they're identifying heroes in Homewood, Brushton. And I immediately connected with his vast knowledge of history. And I wanted to get him on the show, and so he could talk to us more about some of the things that he's doing. And but I was particularly impressed with the mission of what they're doing in Homewood with the American Heroes, where their objective is to identify men who are as we always say on the show, doing heavy lifting, doing great things in the community, making a difference in the lives of the people in Homewood Brushland. And we had some videos that we showed, and I was just really touched. But Mr. Brewer was talking to us about the Wall of Fame. Is that what you call
Yes.
it? The Wall of Fame. And I want him to tell the audience how all that came about, like what we were discussing over our meal, and so they can we can continue.
Well, some 15 years ago, maybe 16 years ago, we were operating Ramsey Street Restaurant, and at the time, we were kind of interested in doing some art, doing some culture, doing some promotions, and one of the first things that was brought up was to possibly do a small reunion with the high school fraternities, one being the Kappas and the other being the Omicrons. They were the two large adversary type fraternities. That grew into later an interest into looking at how can we impact, how can we help the school, how can we bring some images to the students who were there to show some of the greatness of the school. And so a small pack of us met, myself, Valeria Williams, a gentleman who's now deceased, Tommy Tucker, and a couple others. We met and we decided that we would start this wall. We named ourselves the Westinghouse Recognition Commission. And so what we did was we gathered some photos and put together some bios of some people that we felt really needed to be recognized. We actually had around 20 to 25 inductees per year. And so that blossomed very quickly. The relatives of the people that we honored, and even the people that, if they were still living, they came, and their significant others were inducted. Later on, and a short while later, we decided that we needed to raise some finances to help with this wall, because we had to put the wall up at Westinghouse High School as well as the Pittsburgh Coliseum. So we decided to do the day after Thanksgiving as a reunion cabaret, and that blossomed really big. That helped us raise a lot of money, and we were able to take the money, dedicate it to need for two $4,000 scholarships to be given to a student coming out of Westinghouse High School for his or her use for college. And so that got very large. We were able to give out $3,000 or $4,000, even up to $8,000 a year. The last I remember counting we had, I think we had given over $200,000 in about 10 to 12 years. So that the idea of showing images spread quickly. And a lot of the people who came in who were not from Westinghouse didn't realize, Ahmed Jamal, I didn't know he went to Westinghouse. Mary Williams, I didn't know she went to Westinghouse. Or, you know, some of the people that you hear about in the news now, Esther Bush, one of our football coaches, George Webb, on Richburg. So that began to reflect a positive, should I say, image to everyone. And so when kids came into the school, the first thing they see is the Wall of Fame. When they come to the Coliseum, the first thing they see is the Wall of Fame. And so that over a period of years, we've now have about 207 photos on the wall, and those photos range from the early 20s all the way up to probably the 70s or 80s.
Yeah, I remember the first time I saw that wall, I spent a lot of time just going back and forth and seeing some of the people that had graduated from Westinghouse. And what fascinated me the most was looking at the vast array of occupations.
Yes.
And as you were saying, military officers and lawyers and scientists, and you know, it was just you know, and I graduated from Fifth Avenue, and Fifth Avenue has a wonderful history. And but I was just looking at that Westinghouse wall, and I said, man, this is absolutely phenomenal. So I think that's a very, very good thing. And what do you see the wall going from here?
Well, currently, and I should say, a couple years ago, our group really kind of disbanded. We had any number of people who are now deceased. As you know, Dr. Gloria Hill is deceased. She was really a fireball doing this thing. Rip Nixon, Elmer Goodson, Tommy Tucker. So we decided to kind of, we had our day. We got the wall established, and so we now are taking a back seat. Currently, the current alumni at Westinghouse High School is trying to reactivate the wall and put on new people who they could add to the 200-some people that we had, and so that tradition is continuing. Hopefully, that they can begin to make duplicate copies and bring those copies to the Coliseum. But right now, from my understanding, is they've had at least one induction, and I think they're getting ready for another induction.
Have you guys thought about doing a publication?
Yes, as a matter of fact, someone approached me about doing a publication, which could be utilized, and you could raise some money with it, and also it would be very valuable to the alumni. One thing you always noted is when people come in from out of town, they don't have a frame of reference, and if they were able to get that, even if you put it on online, that would certainly help. So we have not taken the role of doing that publication. Perhaps that alumni group would do that, but I definitely think it should be done.
Yeah, I was thinking that would be something that would be a good thing. Mm-hmm. So then you are a very gifted historian, and could you talk about some of the work you do as a historian?
Well, primarily what I do is I try to utilize what archives that I have access to tell a story, to tell a different story. The first story that I chose to try to bring out was depicted in African Americans in Pittsburgh. It's an illustration of the Hill District primarily, because that was the primary place where African Americans lived at, and showing the good times and showing the tough times. That was a way of bringing that to light. The second book was more of a celebration of jazz, mainly Pittsburgh jazz, as being a specific kind of jazz. You have New Orleans jazz, you have other kind of jazz in the South, but Pittsburgh jazz is really very distinct in its development. So that book covers people who were beboppers, that you could think about. So that also gave local living artists an opportunity to be seen in a book. I had there was a young guy that lived down the street from me on Mulford Street, and we used to call him the I forget what his nickname was, but he was like the spick and span man. He beat up pans all the time. He later began to become a quite accomplished drum player and bongo player, and he now is known nationally. And he actually played with Santana and so forth. So when that book came out, he called me up from somewhere and said, "Hey man, give me 10 copies of that book. I don't take it to my family." So that was the kind of thing that we wanted to see, to try to give our local artists an opportunity to be seen and to be counted with the big boys, quite frankly. Mm-hmm. So we had that for the second book. The third book, The Room, as I said, is a kind of a bio on my part, a memory board that talks about the sports. Recently you heard the discussions about concussions. Well, I had 4 concussions, so I understand about concussions. And I also understand that sometimes if someone knows you have a concussion and they still play you, they're using you.
Right.
And so that book was written some time ago, actually 2008. My last book that I just released January of this year it's called Kingpins of Pittsburgh. And again, it was because of my fascination with the Hill and with some really, I think, blue chip characters like Woogie Harris, Gus Greenlee. Many of the people that were there were doing fantastic things that far exceed what people would think happened during that time. So that book shows the relationship between these guys, the influence they have not only on the black community, but on Pittsburgh as a whole.
And on the nation. It's amazing how prominent African-American Pittsburgh is in African-American history and American history. Mr. Van, the intricate role he played in African-Americans becoming Democrats. And the Pittsburgh Courier been the #1 newspaper and the African-American newspaper in the world. And all these people who came from Pittsburgh, my friend George Benson, and we can go on and on and on and on and you know, name these people. But I think that you know, the leadership, Gus Greenlee, Woogie Harris, those people, and the tremendous things that they did in business is something that we know about in Pittsburgh. I don't think that the world knows about it. And as I was saying to you, I like to capture some of that stuff in the form of a motion picture. But yeah, now how did your relationship with the Teenie Harris thing at the museum? I'm just curious about that. How did that come about?
Well, that really came about because I was basically I went to an exhibition in Northside, and they were showing some of Teenie's things, and I came to the exhibition, and one of the first things I realized that the people in that exhibition were not identified. The places were not identified because Teenie really didn't, you know, spend any time identifying. He took the pictures, and that was it. And so the Carnegie Museum of Art, who had control over that collection, they were interested in trying to identify those images. So I happened to run into the curator from the Carnegie. Her name is Lulu Lippincott, and we kind of walked together, and I said, oh, that's so-and-so, that's so-and-so. So then she just latched right on me, and she said, we need for you to come on board with us and help to identify these pictures. So she in turn made available to me literally thousands and thousands of pictures, all folioed in the books. And I would go through them to identify the people I could identify with, but we also set up oral history interviews, which I was doing all along. So, for example, we were talking about, when I talked earlier about the Harriet Tubman group, that was as a result of an interview. And we talked about some of the numbers men. I did interviews with X number of people. If we talked about some of the sports people, you talked to great names like Bill Nunn Jr. He was certainly, I mean, he was the Bible in sports. So over a period of time, I began to get a lot of those pictures identified. And so that information went back to the Carnegie. The Carnegie, in turn, transferred the information in their files so that photo could be identified. That went along for several years until actually 2005. In 2005, I went over to the Pittsburgh Courier to see if I could find some additional pictures that were identified, but they kind of claimed that they had thrown their archive out because they moved out of their Center Avenue location back in 1966. Well, you know, somehow spiritually or whatever, I happened to bump into their collection, which had been obscure since 1966. And that opened up a whole new world. That also accelerated the Teenie Harris photo project 100-fold. So now we have the photo, we have Teenie's picture, and we have even other pictures that were taken that may not have been Teenie pictures, taken by other photographers. You remember Teenie not only was a photographer, but he had a great place to develop pictures. So he developed pictures for, for other photographers. And so that put us in a better, gave us a better shot at identifying the total collection. So right now, probably 85% of that collection has been identified, thanks to the process, through the courier, and through the process of these oral history interviews.
Okay, so I imagine a lot of these people that you've interviewed are pretty well up in the age right now.
Yes.
So do you think you've gotten to most of the people that you need to get to, or there's others that you
Well, they
would
pop
like
up
to?
every day. I mean, it's really funny. There was today, as a matter of fact, I was sitting in the Coliseum, and the barber came over, and he said, "Hey, there's a guy over there at my shop. He's 104 years old. He wants to talk to you. He saw a couple of pictures in that African American book, and he wants to tell you who they are." And so, so what did I do? Of course, I went over to talk to him. The images that are out here are held by many people, and many people have them, even their own scrap collection at home, and they don't maybe realize who's in that picture. A lot of Teenie's photos are very powerful in the forefront, but in the background you can see a lot of different things that help to make some sense about what happened to our history. And so, what I have found is that I've maybe done 150, maybe more oral history interviews, but that does not cover the whole gamut of oral history needed to put Pittsburgh back on the map, at least Black Pittsburgh back on the map again.
Yeah, growing up in the Hill District, I used to see Dean Batt walking up the street, see August Wilson in different places. Of course, he wasn't famous then. Dean Batt was. And I used to see Teenie Harris walking up and down the street with his camera, and I used to stand in front of the Crawford Grill, and when they had the banners up, when Ahmad Jamal and all these famous musicians, I'd just stand across the street and just watch what I call the pretty people, dressed up, going into the Crawford Grill, and I'd just stand across the street at Pat's and just watch them all the time, watch them going in and out of there.
Yeah.
It was a fascinating thing. And I really think that recapturing a lot of that will help the younger people and the youth to realize what a rich heritage that they come from.
Yes.
But it has to be, as I see it, the stories have to be told by us from our perspective. Because if they're told by somebody else from their perspective, first of all, it's not going to have the impact that it needs to have, and the authenticity that's needed will be not there. And so I'd like you to talk about, some of your experiences that we talked about earlier, and some of your views on that.
Well, what I've experienced over the years is that people who you think would not have interest in what we have do have interest. Of the interviews that I've had, or should I say, the research projects I've been on from years ago to now, most of them have come through universities. They have been individual scholars, and unfortunately, not all of them look like us. And that's not a criticism. That is just a reality. I did interviews with a Penn State professor on a book he was doing on Marie Stopes. Somebody that I knew, somebody that I used to kind of hang out at his house. I was his paper boy when I was a kid. And so I could give some perspectives about that. that he could not find in any history book because they were my experiences. And that's good. However, that should have been shared with other folks. Our folks should understand that a man of that stature lived right there, and he went through some real difficult times. So what I have also found is that many people want to just do a kind of a touch and go thing about the history, and that's a violation, in my opinion. I think if you go into it, you should go into it all the way. The Negro Leagues, a lot of people were fascinated by that, but they maybe want to explore some of the little stories they've heard about, George Gibson and other people. They have not explored the political power that the Negro Leagues represented to this country. They were the kind of sports NAACP. They were the civil rights organization at one time. So that's the only thing that we had. So what my experience has been is to try to pick and choose who I talk to and try to understand their scope and if that scope is going to be harmful or not. In some cases, that scope would be harmful because people are taking stories and they're blowing them out of proportion, and they are
over-dramatizing,
yes, over-dramatizing,
taking away that authenticity.
Yes, stereotypes and those kind of things. You really have to be very, very careful about what you say. Yes, we as African Americans, look different ways. We wear our clothes differently. We walk differently. We have a different swagger than other folks do, and that's a part of us. But it should not be made into a criticism. It shouldn't be made into that we're jokers and we're clowns.
Right.
We have had a distinct history that went back to the beginning of civilization, and so you really have to kind of watch what you say and who you say it to.
Right. I, as a screenwriter and a playwright, ever since that I started reading plays, and that's prior to joining Country Repertory Theater with Dr. Renell Lilly and Rob Penny and August Wilson. I was reading plays, and so many of the plays that I read, I was like, wait a minute, we are so much more than this. So I feel very great right now that I'm in position to take a part in that and to be able to create stories and characters that are so much greater than that, that depict our experience in a much richer manner, and that's what I want to do. Like I was saying to you all, I want to produce stories, and I'm very interested in stories about Pittsburgh.
Yes,
because most African American Pittsburgh don't know how rich the history of Pittsburgh is. I mean, Pittsburgh was the #2 cities for Marcus Garvey, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I mean, I explore this story in my book Kingpins, and I say, and how I came into this was that, again, a gentleman came in my place some years ago, and he said, hey, man, we came to these old pictures in the back of my car. They got my uncle in there. He was like useless, man. He said, I want you to have these pictures, So I looked at the pictures, and I almost sucked the breath out of my own body. I said, do you know who this is? And he said, it's my uncle. He's wearing a goofy hat. And he got and he's hanging out with these other black people. I said, it was the Marcus Garvey movement, 1924. And he said, who's Marcus Garvey? Okay, so what I'm saying is he gave me the pictures, and I used them in my book. But when you trace down, you found out that Marcus Garvey had an office up on the hill. He had a UNIA facility, and he was there, and he had a big march downtown on 7th Avenue, right past the Shamrock Hotel or the Shamrock Bar, and that drew hundreds of thousands of people. And so if you're a Gus Greenlee and you're operating numbers, and all of a sudden everybody around you goes downtown, you get a little bit concerned. What are you going to do? You're going to go downtown and see what's happening. So my characters all move to the reality of the day. If black people left Pittsburgh in the 20s and the early 30s, there wouldn't be no numbers because there wouldn't be nobody to play them. You know, so that's a reality. I think too many times, you know, you were just mentioning about people put together scripts and movies and books on the basis of what they think is a marketable product.
Right.
And so they allow the companies to say to you, you know, we don't want a thing on the real life of, you know, Joe Blow. Right now, we want to see black people who were aliens, you know. Or we want to see black people who did this and did that. And so that's sometimes that controls the market and that controls the writer. And as a writer, I don't want to be controlled. I want to write what I want to write about and how I want to write about it, and I'm not going to compromise on it. You know, so if it reaches the movie level or the episode level, then that question is going to come back to you and say, hey, you know, can you cut this out? Can you cut that out? No, because that may be the most important part of the piece that you wrote. So you have to make up your mind, are you in this for the money, or you're in this to really help to expose the kind of history that needs to be exposed?
And I have a strong suspicion that, and it's not really a suspicion because I did lots of research in graduate school when I was trying to identify who my market is, who I'm targeting. But I have a very strong feeling that there's a large market for what we're talking about, that people are thirsty and want to see stories that have these positive depictions of our experience. Nobody wants to see a perfect person. I don't know a perfect person.
Either.
So we're not talking about making people perfect. We're talking about showing all the different facets and sides to our experience. And like you was talking about, a boy, picture a boy, it's you, standing in front of your house, and you seeing these heavyweights coming home with their briefcase. That's part of our experience.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, now what's happening on the street corner, growing up in the Hill District, that was part of our experience.
Part of experience.
But let's be more open and more broad about how we depict this experience. And I think there's a lot of people who want to see that, and they want to see the success story. They don't want to just see stories, and that's what fascinated me about what you guys are doing at Homewood. Just the negative side. You know, let's hear about some of the positive stuff that's going on. Let's hear about the heroes in the community, the people who are doing the heavy lifting, the people who genuinely care about the people in that community.
Yeah, and they're unknown names. I mean, they're names that are seldom said, but they're always to be understood. I mean, you know, for example, I could say I could go down the street and see a guy named Mr. Alexander. He was a construction worker. You know, he always had looked like he had concrete in his hands all the time, and I could see him, you know, working on his garage. And I saw the smile on his face when he finished his own garage. You know, he did put every brick in himself. Every day he would bring home, you know, his little pack, and he'd have some things in it. And he would also he had like a little truck. He had so many bricks, so many blocks stone, and he built this place. And when he was done, you know, he like invited us to come in into the garage right out the alleyway, and we kind of like hung out there, and he served pop and whatnot in celebration of it. So that was not something that the local newspaper would ever pick up. Yeah, no one's going to ever talk about that. But seeing his pride and what he did reflected back on us. You know, we could see that he became our hero. He became a guy that was just a common guy, but he did his thing. We need to see more of that. There's some other people out here that have that I have run into who've had influence on me, and it might be, some of them may be nameless. I may not even know the person's name.
Oh yeah, yeah. We had a lot of those, and that's why I'm so big on mentoring. I think about just my own personal appearance, Stu, at the Anna B. Hellman Center, and Reverend Mason, and Zeke Winters at the Y, and these people, they had a tremendous impact on my life in those after-school programs. Mm-hmm. And that's why I am so large on mentoring, after-school programs, and just, giving, these kids, a lot of kids don't have all the things they need around them to, be wholesome. I think you have some images that you want to show the audience.
Yeah. These images are a part of the presentations we made for the appreciation for Homewood, or for every black community over a period of years. I've documented. This first picture here is 7101 Apple Street. Was really known as Mystery Manor. It was owned by Woogie Harris, who was a numbers man. He was a businessman, a racketeer, if you want to call him. But it is a place of great culture, of great connection. It's a 17-room mansion. On the second floor, 1941, Woogie gave permission to Mary Caldwell Dawson to move her opera house there. So it becomes the first Negro opera house in the country.
Wow.
And so Mystery Manor, they called it Mystery Manor because you never knew what was going on. I interviewed some people. I said, why do you call that Mystery Manor? He said, one day a fleet of cars would pull up and you'd see Lena Horne get out, Billy Eckstein, and they didn't know what was going on. Another day it might be Meadowlark Lemon, from the Globetrotters. Sarah Vaughan, she came in town. It was also a place used as a place to stay particularly for black athletes, because they could not get admittance to the downtown hotels.
Right.
And so people like Roberto Clemente stayed there before. And so it's a 17-room mansion, and it was owned by the Harris family. They called it Mystery Manor, did everything in it. In my book, I exposed some real secret things that happened in that mansion, which I think you might found entertaining.
Oh, I have to grab that book.
Yeah, you'll have to check it out. Here we have, right across the street from me, at Frankstown, and actually Frankstown and Sterrett. If you go up about a half a block, we're talking over 100 years ago, you have this circle. It's called West Penn Driving Park Association. It was a 1-mile track. It was a racetrack in Homewood. It was the first racetrack built in the city. And of course, when they abandoned the track, what do? They named the street Race Street. So it is called Race Street now, but it was a racetrack, and they drove their cars around, and the rich people came there. They did the betting on the winner and so forth. But it was a physical racetrack right in Homewood, right in the middle of Homewood. Here we have the inside of the Pittsburgh Coliseum as it looked as the Pittsburgh Railways had ownership many years ago. You see all those tracks running through it, and the truss, and you see there's places to lift up trolleys. The Pittsburgh Railways was a significantly large monopoly that was owned by them, and they were able to operate the trolleys. So right at the Coliseum, they bring the trolleys in. Each of the trolley barns had a specific function. The trolley barn that I now own was where they did the maintenance. And we go back to that racetrack. In the middle of that racetrack, a descendant of Senator Moorhead from England, she got some pecans, and she punched 6 holes in the ground. And they decided to establish this first 6-hole golf course.
Wow.
Right in Homewood.
Wow.
1893. There she is teeing off. And here we have at the corner of Homewood Avenue and Frankstown, the famous corner. And if you look closely, you'll see Clay Leroy Irvis there with some politicians, and it's political time, and their politicians, of course, are vying to get support in the black community, and they came out and they met on site. And in the background, you see one of those trolley barns. Here we have Rosedale Street. These were built by a famous architect back many years ago. There were 12 of them. They had, each of those had, they had something in the neighborhood of 12 units each. So there's 144 units on Rosedale. Currently, they're new homes. But these places were very, very significant from an architectural standpoint. Here we have where I used to sneak off when I was a kid, or when my father was going to rip my rear end, the steps. And they're on, you go to Oakwood Street, you follow those steps all the way up to the top. There's 700 of them. And I used to walk up there and get up to the top. But you see the top view, you can look out through Pittsburgh. You can see downtown Pittsburgh, Oakland. you can, but also more significantly, you can make sure that your parents who are looking for you will never find you. That was my spot.
They wasn't coming up those steps.
Yes. Rose, I love them steps.
So that's wonderful.
And here we have one of my favorite topics, is Silver Lake. Silver Lake and Westinghouse Bowl. Westinghouse High School had a football bowl, and at the bottom of the bowl was Silver Lake. Silver Lake is a physical lake that goes back to many, many, many years. It's said that Silver Lake had, back in the colonial times, Indians who were mystical Indians, and nobody messed with them. You know, they had Iroquois Indians around, they had Sioux, they had all kind of Indians. They wouldn't mess with these guys because they were mystical, and so they kind of had a curse on that land, and people who violated it, you know, had some problems. As a player at Westinghouse, we realized that some time ago that we should always make sure that our opposition parks where that lake used to be. And so when they do that, they always lost. So when I went to Peabody, I told the driver, whatever you do, don't park where Silver Lake was at. Park at the top, and we end up winning the game. But yeah, Silver Lake has a lot to do with the movement of water in Homewood.
That's great. So as we get to the end of the show, I always ask my guests, this is a tradition on my show, sir. First of all, I really, really enjoyed this. Everybody knows I'm a history nut. I'm crazy about history, and that's why I use it so much in my work. What are your last thoughts that you want to share with the audience?
Well, I believe that my last thoughts are that we should continue to open up doors to our own reality. And the doors don't have to be real fancy doors. They can be doors in your house. You can be looking at your grandmother's Bible. You can look through some pictures. Hook up with your ancestors, you know, with your living ancestors. Always trying to find those stories and document those stories. And don't be afraid to share them. You know, our number one problem is we don't share. If we share those stories, you'd be surprised what comes out of those things. I'm grateful over the years to have the support of my wife and support of many other people who are in the community who also share my view or their views about history. And now that I have a new friend over here, he's another person that I'm grateful for. So thank you.
Yeah, and my last thoughts is it was a great pleasure having you on my show. You know, our theme is one single person, you know, can make a difference and change the world. I am particularly fascinated and emotionally, you know, connected to African American history, and you see Mr. Brewer is the expert in the room. And you know, I've spoken to him about doing some collaborations, and hopefully we can do that. And maybe, never know, some great motion pictures may come out of this. But I always talk about those individuals in the community who are unsung because they are, in many cases, oftentimes doing the truly the heavy lifting in our community. And not that they are trying to get credit, but they're not oftentimes being recognized the way we feel they should. So the purpose of this show is to get people like Mr. Brewer on the show so the viewing audience can see what wonderful, wonderful work he's doing and what kind of talents he has. He's at the Homewood Coliseum. He's the owner of the Homewood Coliseum. You can reach out to him there. What would be a number that they could?
412-478-0106.
Could you say that one more time?
Okay, 412-478-0106.
And I would personally like to thank everyone. I have several friends that I talk to who I found out are very, very regular viewers of this show and supporters of this show and what we're trying to do here. And I want to take this moment to say thank you for all those individuals who are tuning in on Wednesday nights at 9 o'clock to watch this show. And one single person can make a difference and change the world. And if you start multiplying those one single people, then you have a community of people who are committed to turning the community around, to transforming our community. And we believe in our hearts that we can do that. We can transform our community and make it what we perceive that we think it should be and want it to be. And on that, I say, bye.
Bid you well.